Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Nancy Birdsall, I like to say the proud president of the Center for Global Development. I'm particularly proud today to see this large and distinguished crowd. I also want to say that you are not everybody that's here. We have an overflow room upstairs, and we're doing a live webcast of today's event. The purpose of the annual Richard Sabot Memorial Lecture is obviously to honor the memory of Richard Sabot, friend, friend, scholar, internet entrepreneur, and founding member of the CGD board. How pleased he would be to be here today and to see the growing interest in development and to see how far the Center for Global Development has come. A special welcome to our distinguished speaker who has brought out this impressive group, Esther Duflo, whom we'll be hearing from in a few moments. I want to welcome many of our board members who are here, and Ed Scott, who for a family reason is arriving a little late. We would not be what we are without these distinguished board members, particularly those who are founding members, some of whom will be leaving the board after tomorrow's board meeting. Bernie Aronson, Susan Levine, who has served as vice chair, Jessica Einhorn, Bruns Grayson, Peter McPherson, and John Reed, as well as Angel Gurria, who is the head of the OECD and couldn't be here today. I'm also delighted to have members of Dick's family with us here today, and it is now my pleasure, as has become the custom, to introduce to you Dick's son, Oliver Sabot, who is following in his father's footsteps with a career in development, currently as Vice President of the Clinton Health Access Initiative. Oliver.
Well, thanks, Nancy, and a huge thank you to the Center for this tribute, which is really a tremendous honor to my father's memory. And what I do every year before this lecture is go through the transcript of an interview he did a few years before his death, and which really captures well his spirit and his thinking on development and many other issues. And I was looking at it earlier today and saw him reflecting on how excited he was and how committed he was to CGD. And so to echo what you said earlier, that he would be tremendously proud to see where CGD has come over the past 10 years. So in the past several years, I've started by talking about a word or two that embodied my father's approach to development and life in general. And those included gratitude and optimism and other words. And this year, as I was thinking about the topic and Esther's talk and the dialogue that is currently happening about global development and global health, I came on perhaps an unexpected word, which is failure. I wanted to briefly reflect on my father's thoughts related to failure, which is ironic, of course, because he was very successful in academia, very successful in business, and very successful in his personal life. Not at all things, but in general very successful. But what he would say is that certainly he didn't succeed at all things, and that the secret to that success was very much risk-taking and experimentation. So as I think about the question of why we as a global development community don't learn more from all of the approaches that we take on, all of the massive investments that we make, there's a simple answer for me that I think my father would fully agree with, and that's that we're afraid. We're afraid of the answers that will be shown when we do evaluate. We're afraid of admitting our own ignorance about the work that we do, and we're afraid of failure. We're afraid that these programs and these interventions that we take on and spend so much of our lives and our money on will be shown to not have the impact that we intended. And there's a dialogue going on right now, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, around global health and development, that given the constraints in financing that we're now starting to feel quite acutely, certainly up at Capitol Hill, but around the world, that we need to become more risk averse, that we need the way to stretch every possible dollar and get the most value out of that dollar that we do have available is to track it and to follow it more closely. And my father would reject that idea. I would reject the idea that what we need now is more conservatism, and rather he would say that in this difficult time, what we need is actually more experimentation. That we need to do more to find out what can work and what will work with the resources that we have available, and that if we retreat into what is safe, we have already failed. This the spirit of fear of failure is something that all of us here are probably in our own way culprits of. We've all contributed to that each time that we pick up the newspaper and think with derision or skepticism about some program that we hear about that's failed. We are contributing to a culture of fear that prevents us from failure. And so I would encourage all of us next time we see some report to think to laud or think with pride of those that have tried something ambitious and failed, rather than with derision. So I'd like to end those brief thoughts just with a specific quote from that interview that I mentioned with my father's direct words on this, in which he said, the best metaphor for success, whether of a Nobel Prize winner or an accomplished businessman, is play. Fundamentally, they are playing around, trying to make things work, to see what a new approach can do. Playfulness, humility, and recognition of our relative ignorance, those are the prime ingredients of success. I look forward to Esther's talk on these issues and to finding out how all of us can learn to play more. Thank you.
Oliver, that was a very powerful and compelling introduction to what we'll be talking about, or what Esther will be talking about. Thank you so much. Your father would be proud of you. So each year, CGD pays tribute to Dick's commitment by hosting a leading development policy intellectual who's been active both as a scholar and as a policy practitioner. And we have tonight a great person in terms of reflecting those qualities, Esther Duflo. She is the Abdul Latif Jameel Professor of Poverty Alleviation and Development Economics at MIT and co-founder of the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, well known in the development community as JPAL. Esther is the winner of the 2010 John Bates Clark Medal, perhaps other than the Nobel, the most coveted prize in economics, awarded each year by the American Economics Association to an American economist under the age of 40. And it is awarded for, quote, a significant contribution to economic thought and knowledge. And it is very exciting when an economist who's working on development and poverty issues receives the John Bates Clark Award. Esther's motto, for those of you who saw the New Yorker profile of her some time ago, is research into action. And so she's a great speaker for the Center for Global Development tonight, because that is in many ways our philosophy and our motto as well. Esther's lecture will draw on a new book she co-authored with Abhijit Banerjee, a JPAL co-founder with her. The book is entitled Poor Economics, A Radical Rethinking of the Way to Fight Global Poverty. Esther and Abhijit's research has led them to identify wholly new aspects of the behavior of poor people which matter for policy, their needs, their behavior, and how interventions, investments from outside can affect their lives. Esther was a member of CGD's, she is a member of CGD's Research Advisory Board, and she served on our working group on impact evaluation some years ago. And when Oliver was talking about risk-taking and failure, I remembered very well Esther's contribution to that working group. She really had an outsized influence, pushing for the kinds of research that I think she'll be talking about tonight, that I'm sure she'll be talking about tonight. So as we celebrate our 10th anniversary this year, I can't think of a speaker who better combines for us or brings together for us the honor of honoring Dick's memory about failure and the need to learn from trial and error, and about the ideas to action approach. I'm pleased to welcome Esther Duflo.
Nancy, thank you very much. Oliver, thank you very much for this quote, which I'm very pleased to. I could hardly think of a better introduction for the type of work that I'm trying to do and the significance that it may have. Indeed, most of my work has been focused on trying to figure out what policy may work in helping to address the problems that are linked to poverty, those that cause poverty, or those that are caused by poverty. And to this end, a lot of my work has been on the evaluation of the effectiveness of various policy options, particularly, but not only on randomized evaluation. I also have spent a lot of time trying to understand how poor people behave and why they behave the way they do at the most micro and detailed level. Success. I think that computer went to bed. So in our new book, Abhijit, which is Poor Economics, Abhijit Banerjee and I try to dissect what has been learned, not only from our research, but from decades of development economics research, on the key problems and issues that affect the economic lives of the poor. Health, education, saving, credit, entrepreneurship, etc. Our view is that one needs to understand these issues in a lot of details in order to design policies that have a chance to work. This may seem somewhat reminiscent of the management book from the 1950s, that you have to start to go to the field and understand what the problems really are if you want to be able to solve them. And at some level it is. It's kind of plain vanilla common sense. But what is quite striking is that this seems to be very far removed from the way that policy is actually made on a day-to-day basis, either here or in developing countries. And the key reasons why a lot of effort to help the poor routinely fail is not because there is a great conspiracy against them working, but because they are based on a misunderstanding of the real problems is that these efforts are trying to get at, and a failure to attempt to learn from experience. And I would again reinforce that the idea that we need to embrace failure as a way to learn would have helped us probably avoid the bigger failure of not knowing where we are many, many years later. For example, countries spend tremendous amount of money and time and effort trying to deliver food to people. A lot of the food is lost along the way, some is eaten by rats, some go to people who don't particularly need it. So the only reason why you would want to do that is if you would feel that food was really the major constraint that stands between the poor and becoming less poor. But in fact, when you study the budget and the economic lives of the poor, it turns out that poor are not particularly hungry for more calories. When the price of grains go down, they don't eat more grain. When their income increases a little bit, They don't particularly eat more. They eat better quality food, but not particularly more calories. So the problem seems to be a way to improve the nutritional quality of what they eat, and maybe to understand why it is the case that they might not be so hungry for more calories, even though they are evidently malnourished. But that's not the way the problem is usually phrased in policymaking. Another example is education. A lot of efforts have been spent in trying to put kids into school. And at some level, we have been very successful as that, as a planet. But about half of the kids who are in school in a large country like India are actually not able to read. About 2/3 are not able to do a very basic division. So it seems that we are missing something completely essential about what schools are trying to do. We've been very good at getting the kids into school, but we've been less good at trying to figure out what it is they need to learn, how it is we can teach what they need them to learn. So it's a huge waste of time, resources, and talent, and yet in principle this can be fixed. So the idea that spending more time understanding the problems that the poor really face and spending more effort trying to analyze them, trying things out, failing and retreating and coming back again, thinking in a more, venture capitalist way of how to design policy, that seems to be that idea still has some progress to make and potentially some contribution to bring. But many people are somewhat suspicious of these efforts. Maybe not suspicious, but thinking maybe these efforts are not that important. That by focusing on this kind of detailed policy design issues and policy evaluation issues, we've sort of abandoned the forest for the tree, that we have lowered our ambition, that the key ambition should be to understand the big macroeconomic issues that confront countries or the big institutional issues. And what I want to talk about today is this idea of institutions. There is a institutionalist view that has a fair amount of currency in development economics today and in political economy, which is that the real problem of development is not to figure out policy, it is to figure out politics. In other words, without good politics, we can't have good policies, and with good politics, good policy will follow quite naturally. And the current event in the Middle East, in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Libya, in Syria, certainly leads one to think about this and give it some credence. Isn't it the case that the revolution that's happening there, whatever come out of them, are going to have more influence on the fate of people over there than any effort we might have been doing trying to figure out the labor market in those countries? We didn't, but we might have. And then there is Côte d'Ivoire. How much good would it do right now to know the best way to convince kids to immunize their children in Côte d'Ivoire? Nobody is immunizing anybody at the moment. This view of institutions as dominating the fate of people in developing countries can lead to pessimism. As our colleague Daron Acemoglu and Jean Robinson have argued, institutions have a tendency to persist. Current leaders inherit inherit institutions, and those who have inherited poor institutions which have not very many constraints on the executive, which led them to plunder away, probably like those institutions, want to keep them alive. And therefore, these institutions tend to remain very, very persistent. So countries that have inherited bad institutions from the colonial period will tend to keep those bad institutions. So if you read the work of Acemoglu and Robinson, it makes you a little bit depressed because there is really no idea that we have from how we get out of this. Sometimes there might be a revolution. The successful examples that they have to quote in their forthcoming book is the French Revolution, which of course I appreciate, and the Glorious Revolution in the UK, which I appreciate much less. Both of them were centuries ago. I don't want to... And so we don't really know how institutions change. Episodes of wholesale institutional reform are few and far between, though we may be in the middle of witnessing one. And we don't know how to predict those episodes, let alone how to make them happen, let alone how to make them happen in the direction that is potentially positive. So it's not a very hopeful message. It might be the right message anyway, but one is tempted to see, can we do something in between? So I don't want to minimize the role of politics. I think politics matter. But what I want to argue today, which is largely based on the last chapter of our book with Abhijit, is that the primacy of politics over policy might be overemphasized. So the political economy view, as I described it, is that politics determine policy. What I want to argue is that maybe that's not so much true. Maybe there is scope within policy. And maybe even that it's possible to reverse the argument. Maybe policy, in some amount, in some measure, also determine politics. So I'll proceed in 3 steps. First, I'll argue that perhaps institutions are not that different from school system or healthcare, that we shouldn't necessarily think of them in big capital letter, big things that can't change, that institutions in practice are embodied in a number of very detailed rules, and that thinking about these rules in details might actually have a lot of payoff. Secondly, I want to make a quick case for the fact that there is tremendous amount of scope for better policy or worse policy within given institutional environments, good or bad. And third, this last point, that good politics can sometimes follow from good policies, still easily setting off a virtuous circle. Okay, forget it. There was nothing, you're not missing anything fundamental. Just so you know, nice pictures and some cues for me of what I'm supposed to talk about now. So I might forget something along the way. But so the political economy view starts from a very broad view of institution. When you think of institution, this is democracy versus autocracy. This is property right constraint on the executive, very mile, 1,000-mile away view. And if we think about institutions this way, then it is correct that these institutions are very hard to move. They hardly change. They are persistent. These wholesale institutional changes are few and far between. However, those institutions only define a broad framework. And within that, there is a lot of scope for variation within those frameworks. And those are much more versatile. Those can be affected much more. The first margin of action is that within pretty bad institutions, there can also be improvement at the margin. For example, we rarely see non-democracy going wholesale to being democracy. Happens, but not very frequently. What we do see frequently, however, is non-democratic regime introducing a measure of democracy. This has happened, for example, in Indonesia under Suharto, in Brazil under the military dictatorship. More recently, the local elections have been introduced in Vietnam in 1998, in Saudi Arabia in 2005, and in Yemen in 2001. Generally, we in the West see this reform as a certain amount of skepticism. The elections are often rigged, and the elected officials have very limited power because it's within a pretty constrained regime. And yet there is some compelling evidence that even these very imperfect local elections actually make a substantial difference on the ground. I'll cite just one study from China by Nancy Chen and Gerard Padroe-Miguel. What they look at is the introduction of local election in Chinese villages. Those local elections started to be introduced progressively in the 1980s, and the elections were very imperfect. The candidates were often designated by the party. The ballots were usually not, and the vote was not anonymous, the ballots were stuffed, etc. So it's not your example of an ideal democratic reform. And yet what they show, by comparing places which have introduced the democratic election to those who have not yet done it, is that when you have election, that does make the elected leader, however imperfectly elected, much more accountable to the villagers. In particular, after a village starts holding election, the village chiefs are more likely to relax unpopular policies such as the one-child policy. The reallocation of farmland, which happens from time to time in China, benefits more like the middle class, so to speak. And the public expenditures are also more likely to reflect the villagers' need. So even though nothing has changed at the broad level, at the local level in the life of the people, these very small marginal changes make actually a real difference. Another example in the same class is corruption. When countries are very, very corrupt, it is very difficult for them to get out of this corruption. countries don't generally shift many places in the Transparency International ranking. Indonesia is an example. In 2010, it was number 110 out of 178 countries in the Transparency International ranking, despite the fact there had been democratic reform along the way. So you could see, well, if a country is deeply corrupt, everything is corrupt about this country, and there is really nothing we can do. Ben Holken did a very interesting experiment where he looked at theft at the local level. So he looked at local villages are constructing roads, and theft is rife. About 20% of the material and 25% of the wage bill is stolen by the local construction teams. So what he did is that he went and worked with the government to threaten some of these villages with systematic audit at the end of the year. So everybody knew they would be audited. But of course, who would audit them? The government auditors, who are the same perfectly corrupt people probably. So you would have expected, in fact, it probably would have been my prior, that that's not going to work, because who is going to monitor the monitors? You have to change the system. And yet, this reform, which he implemented in 300 villages, randomly selected out of 600, had an effect of reducing the amount of theft of material by about 1/3. So even without changing the broad system, you do manage to have changes at the margin, and they amount to something. A reason why democracies often fail in Africa, it's argued, in particular in the sort of political science world, is that voting is based on ethnic loyalty, which means that the candidate from the larger ethnic group is likely to win, however its quality and otherwise merit. So that leads to corruption, that corruption goes in the way of the ethnic voting. And for a lot of political scientists, this is something that is very deeply ingrained. Depending on your political leaning, it can come out of your sort of the culture, or it can come out of the historical legacy. But regardless, it's considered to be maybe the product of both history and a political equilibrium that is hard to shift. A study by Leonard Wansheken, a very interesting study in Benin, exposed just how much this ethnic loyalty, how strong it is. He did, Leonard Wansheken is from Benin. He was a student activist, so he is known everybody in Benin politics. And that allowed him to run an experiment where political parties agreed to randomize the message with which they were going to go to the people. That's why it would have been nice to have the quote, but I'll read it slowly. So in some villages, you hear the clientelist message. We are the representative of the candidate Saka Lafia, that's an example, one of the candidates, who is running for president in the March 2001 election. As you know, Saka is the only Bariba candidate, actually the first since 1960. Saka is running because the northeast region, Borgu Alibori, is very underdeveloped, low literacy rates, poor rural infrastructure and healthcare, etc. If elected, he will help promote the interest of the Borgu Alibori region by building new schools, hospitals and roads, and more importantly, hiring more Bariba people in the public administration. So that's your clientelist message. And then he had the public policy message. We are the representative of Saka Lafia. Our party, the UDS, stands for Democracy and National Solidarity. Saka is running against the opposition candidate in the north. If elected, he will engage in a nationwide reform of the education and healthcare system with emphasis on building new schools, new hospitals, and vaccination campaigns. In conjunction with other opposition leaders, he will fight corruption and promote peace between all ethnic groups and all regions of Benin. These campaigns was run in relatively safe constituencies, so both messages garnered a lot of votes, but the clientelist message carried about 80% of the vote, and the public policy message just under 60%. Keep this experiment in mind, because we'll return to it in another experiment in Benin that Wansheken also done, but a little later in the talk. In the meantime, I want to investigate whether this ethnic voting is particularly entrenched, because what this experiment shows us is that there is ethnic voting, not that people could not be persuaded otherwise. But I think a lot of us would think that this is something that would be pretty deeply entrenched. So Abhijit Banerjee, Rohini Pandey, and Don and Jennifer Green did an experiment in Uttar Pradesh, another region where community-based voting is very, very deep, although people vote along caste line, not along ethnic line. And what they did is something very simple. They worked with an NGO, which went to the villages and did a campaign saying, hey, you should really vote on issues, not on caste. There was no informational content, just this one message in an attractive way, you know, puppet shows and theater for the kids and all that and the other. But that was the message. And what they find was that this message, the don't vote on caste, vote on issue, reduced the probability that someone would choose a candidate from their own caste by about a third, from 25% to 18%. So that shows that maybe people vote from their caste mainly out of indifference, maybe because they don't know who is better, maybe it's not clear to them, maybe no one is better, and then you might as well go with someone with your last name. So this suggests that these institutions that have problems can be arranged. There is no fatality to ethnic voting. There is no fatality to corruption, even in systematically corrupt environments. But another margin, which is very important, is that good institutions, good broad institutions, proper political systems, etc., are also not a guarantee that the institution, in small letters if you want, the way they are embodied in the rules will actually work very well. And I'll give you a fascinating example from Brazil. It's a study by Thomas Fujiwara, who is a graduate student at University of British Columbia. Brazil democracy is very vibrant, which is nice, and as a result, there are many candidates. One problem with having very many candidates is that you have a very, very long list of people to choose from. So the way it used to be organized in Brazil is that you have to take the long list of candidates, identify who you want to vote for, identify who their number is, and write it down in your ballot. In a country where a decent fraction of the population is not fully functionally literate, that had the result of disenfranchising people, like by just making their vote invalid for no other reason. So at some point, Brazil introduced electronic voting. They didn't do that because they wanted to fix this problem, I don't think. According to Fujiwara, they did that because they wanted to count the vote faster. But they introduced this nice little machine where now you had to punch the code of your candidate on the little machine. So you still have to punch the candidate, but once you punch the candidate, you see a picture of the candidate. And if the code is invalid, you see no one. So that allows you to see whether you voted for someone or not. That essentially eliminated the errors. That meant that 10% of the vote that had been invalid before became valid. And you can look at the effects because the reform was first introduced in large towns and then in smaller towns. So you can look at what happened in a large town compared to the smaller town. What he found is that the poor were more likely to vote or to be counted. The uneducated were more likely to vote. The people who were elected were more likely to be less educated and poorer, and the policies that were implemented were more pro-poor. So there was this technical problem that was basically disenfranchising 10% of Brazil's poor, or 10% of Brazil's population, mainly the poor, and that could be fixed. This shows how these details are not details. There are very few political reforms that will lead to a change where the entire political spectrum will move to the left on the wealth dimension. So we have many other examples of this in the book, but I want to shift to the second step in my argument, that even if we were to take those institutions constant, both the institution in capital letter and those small rules of functioning, there is still scope for improving policies. And there again, you could say that you could make the argument both ways. You could say even in relatively bad policy environment, sometimes there is scope for decent policies. And in particular, and also even in relatively good policy environment, there is plenty of scope for very bad policies. So an example of the fact that good policies sometimes happen in bad political environment is again from Indonesia. It is in Suharto's Indonesia that 62,000 primary schools were built with oil money, leading to increase in wages, reduction in fertility, and reduction in infant mortality for the children who were young enough to be exposed to those schools. And more importantly, plenty of bad policies happen in good policy environment. I think not because of any great conspiracy to keep the poor poor, but because in practice, policies do not magically emerge as a result of the democratic process. Policies are made by people. A lot of you probably know that because you're probably in the business of making policy. Policy making does not happen in the void. It's made by men and women. Sometimes they might be ill-intentioned, but a lot of the time might be perfectly well-intentioned, perfectly to do the best they can. But like anything else, it's difficult to make policy. It's probably more difficult because the problems are hard. So it requires a good understanding of a problem, and all of us have this tendency to get it wrong. And unlike in business, and I think that's a key difference, unlike in business, there is no market test for what government do. Voting is not a market test. You've seen in my previous example how people vote. Voting is very imperfect market test. So bad policies can persist and persist and persist and have no reason to be eradicated. Whereas if you produce a bad car, then nobody is going to buy it and you're going to change and produce a better car. That's one important reason why government programs, but also programs run by NGOs and others, often don't work. The problems are difficult, the details need a lot of attention. The failures are often due not to sabotage by a specific group, but because the whole system was badly conceived to start with and no one had taken the trouble to fix it. So in the book, we call this the 3I problem, like ideology, ignorance, and inertia. Schemes conceive in ideology, some cartoon character view of what the poor may want or may need, and in ignorance of the realities in the field, persist of sheer inertia. Once they exist, they are difficult to get rid of, perhaps because it would mean accepting failure, perhaps because there is a constituency of people who are making a living out of this policy and wouldn't like to change. We encounter this 3I problem routinely in our work. We are specifically stuck with one example. We decided to start a project on village education committee in Uttar Pradesh, same place where the election work took place. Every village in India must have a village education committee. Beneficiary participation is very much in fashion here, there, and India has wholeheartedly embraced the idea. So we went to hundreds of villages in Uttar Pradesh before we started our work with the village education committee to find out about people's view of this committee and also to find out who was on it. And what we learned was 8% of villagers knew that the VEC existed, 2% of the villagers knew what they were supposed to do, and perhaps more strikingly, 25% of the committee members did not know that I were part of them. Perhaps as a result of the fact that they didn't know they were part of them, the committees were totally disengaged with the schools. Effort by Pratham, a large and excellent NGO, to reinvigorate this committee were completely useless. And yet, at the same time, in the same villages, Pratham was extremely effective, motivating the villagers to improve the schools, the learning on their own outside of the schools. So the scheme is just defunct. It has no purpose left. So we went and asked the education secretary in Lucknow about the scheme. And they told us how they work, and they said, so you need the parents of the best child in the class, and the parents of the worst child in the class, and the parent of the handicapped child. So we were a bit baffled because exams have been abandoned in the schools. So we asked her, how do you know who is the best child in the class and who is the worst child in the class if you don't have any grades to go on? And then she quickly changed the topic. She just had no idea, or had never asked herself how the village or the teachers were to implement these rules. So that's kind of a classic example of your 3I problem. Inspired by an ideology, people's power is good, designed in ignorance of what people want or how they function. The program, by the time we were studying, was entirely sustained by inertia. No one had paid attention to it in years except for this bureaucrat who was checking the boxes that the village had the committee and there were a few members on it. So large-scale waste and policy failure often happen not because of any deep structural problem, but because of this lazy thinking at the stage of policy design. And therefore, we can improve things a lot. There is tremendous scope for improving policies by trying things out, seeing how they work out, understanding why they worked or didn't work, and moving on from there. So how to do this is what my life is devoted to, and what, of course, we devote a lot of the material in the book to. And that's in itself a worthwhile objective, I think. But to conclude, I would like to go one step further and say that maybe it's useful not only on its own, but also because it could be the beginning of good politics. I often have the feeling that if politics is so depressing in developing countries, it's because voters feel that they have to choose between bad and worse. This may explain why they vote for someone from their caste or ethnic group. No one is in a position to offer them a very credible alternative. I spent a lot of time working in Kenya, where I saw this process happen in real time in front of me, where there was a clear hope at some point that something could be done, and that hope went away because people felt that the government had not delivered. In Wamsikan's Benin experiment, maybe voters did not vote for the public policy messages because it was not credible enough. Perhaps they would have voted for that message if it, instead of having this woolly-headed, like, I will be nice to everybody and their sisters, it instead would have been a practical message oriented around specific policy consideration. I've always thought that, and then Leonard came up with an experiment that actually helped testing that. Leonard now runs a think tank in Benin, and with his think tank and his friends from all of the political parties in Benin, he organized a large policy conference just before the 2006 election, so 5 years after the first experiment. I think it's one of those experts conferences that some of the people who don't like experts would hate. It even had international experts, which probably makes it worse. And it was called Election 2006, What Policy Alternative? They had 4 panels on education, public health, governance, and urban planning. And experts, and 4 international experts, 2 from Benin and 2 from Niger and Nigeria, provide a white paper with policy recommendation at the end of it. After the conference, at the conference, they invited people from all the political parties and people from civil societies, NGOs, etc. And after the conference, some of the parties agreed to take on board some of these proposals as part of their campaign platform. And then they agreed again to run an experiment to see whether that would help them win election and that would hurt them win election. So what they did again is selected some relatively safe constituencies and randomly select villages to have either your traditional campaign meeting complete with balloons and clientelist messages, or town meetings where people would be presented the proposals and would have a chance to discuss them and to give their opinion and things like that. And this time the results were reversed. It is the reasoned policy platform that garnered much more vote than the clientelist messages. I find the message of this study incredibly hopeful. And this is what I want to end on, was to conclude this study. The message of this study, and more generally, I think the message of what I was trying to say today, is a message of hope and a message of responsibility. The hope part is that the problem that face the poor, they are hard to understand, they're hard to grasp. Mostly we get it wrong, and mostly as a result, the solution is disappointing and progress is slow, but it happens. It is slow, but it's there. We have made progress. The world has made tremendous amount of progress over the last few decades, since the World War II, for example. So we cannot shield behind fatalism. Neither bad politics nor bad policies are fatality in poor countries. Politics can be improved step by step. Policies can be improved even within a given institutional environment, certainly if we manage to improve the institutional environment as well. And improving policies might well be a first step, an ingredient in actually improving the politics in turn. So things can be improved here and now. Perhaps not in a revolutionary swoop, perhaps not in a process that is going to be massive and gigantic, but step by step in something that will be more like a quiet revolution. Where the responsibility lies is that everyone has a role to play in this process. It's not history, it's not the leaders of the world, it's kind of all of us, and when I say all of us, it's all of us here and all of us in developing countries, which have some little piece of this puzzle at their disposal. It's not someone else's job to figure out what might work or to let it happen. It's our collective duty. here is the West, as well as in developing countries themselves. It's not going to be easy. You have to experiment, you have to keep trying. Things that work somewhere might not work elsewhere, but eventually, little by little, we are going to get there. So I think we have to take the first step.
Bravo, Esther. Lots of good stories and a message of hope at the end. I'm going to sit down and have a little bit of interchange, and then we'll turn to all of you for your comments and questions. And let me start by saying that I just came back from a week in Pakistan, and so much of what you said is applicable to the situation there. It's a country where there has been a transition to democracy. There is a lot of frustration about grand policy making, but there are some changes going on that are quite invisible, but could be quite fundamental in the long run. The second thing I wanted to do for all of you who are here is to say something about how Esther's work is embedded in a larger debate in the development community, in particular about what outsiders should do. Is it possible for those in the rich world to help, whether with policy advice or with aid itself in the form of money? And where Esther's work has been important and sometimes controversial is the idea that many have, particularly in the aid community, that there has to be evaluation of aid itself, not only or just interventions that a government is doing or not doing, but of whether what the donors are doing is complementary or counterproductive. And in that debate, there's been a lot of discussion about, are these micro-studies getting to the point? What do we do about evaluating whether the World Bank or the United States should give big money aid, what's called budget support or program support? So let me start with that long introduction and ask Esther if she would be willing to just say a word about that, what she knows and what she thinks about that larger question, because we have several people here, several of whom I might impose upon to comment as well. Esther.
Sure, I might say something somewhat controversial in this particular audience. I'm a little nervous to say it, but at some level, I don't think the question of whether aid is good or bad is such an important question. Aid is a pretty small bit of all of the money that is being spent to help the poor worldwide. India is a very big country which has very many poor people and receives essentially no aid. Even in Africa, where the aid is a bigger part of the budget, it's still not that large. It's not, it's not 50%, it's not even 25% for the continent as a whole. So I think when we sit here in Washington, then we think aid is incredibly important. But if we take the worldwide picture, the question is not that. The question is, how do we make policies work, whether they are funded by aid or whether they are funded by someone else? And I think that's where, if we agreed with that and stop being concerned about whether aid is good or bad, then we can maybe make aid more effective in one particular dimension, which is to say, well, since we are always going to be pretty small, the aid is always going to be pretty small, instead of just spending it, can we spend it in a way to maximize its ability to teach us something? Can we think of aid as like the venture capitalism of the innovation in the world, taking the risk to try things out that fail? And I think if we were less focused on trying to show how great or how bad we are, then maybe we would have moved in that direction. So when when I work on evaluating impacts of projects funded by aid, it is not because at the end of the day I want to see whether aid is good or bad, particularly, although one could think that it would add up to something at the end, but it's because I want to know whether that was a good or a bad project. Because that piece of information is going to help me understand and give me a small part of the puzzle for what should be a policy that could possibly address this problem.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I'm sure we have a couple of people in the front row that might want to talk about that or just agree or not agree. One is, if I can do this to you, one is Steve Radelet. I'll start with Steve, who was a senior fellow at the Center for a long time and is now the chief economist at USAID. And the other is Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who gave this Sabot lecture 2 years ago, I think. I've got the dates right. And is a managing director, which is the managing directors are second only to the president at the World Bank. Steve or Ngozi, do you want to say anything? Not necessarily about what Esther said, but about the larger questions. Ngozi.
Thank you, Nancy. Well, first of all, thank you for a very interesting lecture. And interesting, I think, contrary to your trepidation in making the comment you made, I couldn't agree more. You know, let me comment on that first, and then I come to a question. I think that even within the poorer countries, this aid debate and the impact of aid is a little passé, if I may say so. People are really moving on. The countries are moving on. And if we don't pay attention, we'll be left behind. So what you're saying is absolutely true. People are focusing whether aid is 50% of their budget, as it is in some countries, like Rwanda, for instance, or it's below the line. When I was Minister of Finance, I mean, aid was less than 5%. Of the budget in Nigeria, so it didn't really matter. And people have a different mentality now. What they're focusing on is indeed the question of what are effective policies or projects or programs which they can use aid to either test in a catalytic fashion or scale up where it works. So I want to agree with you. And yes, from the point of view of the World Bank, we are moving along too. Maybe slowly, you know, it takes time to change the mindset and culture of a big institution. But looking at aid as catalytic in some senses, or as a scaling up mechanism, depending on from which point you're starting, is really the way for us to go. Because the big problems we're trying to solve down in many of the poor countries will require interventions that are well beyond the resources of any one organization. It will require aid, it will require domestic resource mobilization, and it will require the private sector coming in. So I want to agree. Then going to your micro level observations, the question I had for you as somebody who made policy and saw some of that policy work, both at a larger level. You can look at it. I think you need to look at several levels of policy making. On the micro or even macro level, the key question that concerns me, and I like your message of optimism that says, look, policies, systems and institutions can make a difference to politics. The key question for you that I had was sustainability. So you can make an intervention at the micro level, which can change things. But the issue is, how do you sustain that, even within the micro environment that you have? It could work that one time, but something else happens. And unless you have good politics that follows, those interventions are likely not to last. So what's your comment on that?
Do you want to go to that, or should we? Yes, go to that.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I guess the point was, I was not trying to say that, that we can just ignore politics altogether. Just, I guess one point is that even politics we can try to improve in order to give a little bit more stability to these things, even at a local level, make things work a little bit better. Even within democracy, make sure that democracy work a bit better. Within decentralized government, make sure that people are invited to meetings, things like that. It can actually make huge difference on the type of decisions that are being made. And therefore on the sustainability of whatever intervention is being made. And the second argument was that the policies can create, in some cases, their own little virtuous circle of, if you start seeing that a policy is successful, then you get a little bit less despondent about what the political system can do. Then once people are a bit less despondent and try to reward people for performance and not for whoever, wherever they come from, then that also give people incentive to actually deliver in this direction. And things that work and that are popular have a tendency to stay in power. I mean, the one example that is a very, very popular example is Progressa. That, sustained despite the change in government and then expanded in a number of different political contexts just because it was, a very powerful program.
Yeah, we have, Esther was nodding to Santiago Levy, who was the architect of that program. And actually, one of the most important things that Santiago and others did is, from the beginning, ensure there was an independent evaluation with baseline data. So that's another example of what Esther is championing here, namely evaluation. Steve, do you want to say anything about Esther's comment on the role of aid?
Thanks. It reminds me to not sit in the front row at CGD. I'll take a seat in the back. But thanks, and thanks for a great lecture. And I am looking forward to the book. It's out next week or the week after or something?
April 26th.
April 26th.
April 26th.
April 26th. I keep going to Amazon and it's not ready yet. So I'm very much looking forward to it.
I think there's a lot on the web already.
Yeah,
there's a lot of teaching materials and others, which is terrific. So thanks for that.
Do buy the book.
Right. I'm doing your marketing for you. I have thought for a long time that the debate about development has been too much characterized and captured by the debate about whether aid works or not. And I think it's been taken to extremes that has not been good for people who are working on foreign assistance, but also it has not been good for furthering the understanding about development, because I have seen too often that it gets conflated by people who believe that aid works or doesn't work, whatever that means, which then is taken to mean that development has or has not been successful or has not worked, which is too bad. And the extreme views on that I don't think have been helpful. And it hasn't been helpful for us, for USAID as an institution either, because that has influenced the thinking for the American public and for people up on Capitol Hill who are sort of influenced by those broad statements about it either works or it doesn't work, or and therefore something easy to cut, which unfortunately we're seeing right now in front of us. But the real issues are exactly what you said. The question is what things work and don't work in development, whether it's a micro level or a macro level. 20 years ago, of course, more of the focus rightly was on macro issues. But it wasn't about whether aid worked or not. It was whether exchange rate policies were appropriate and interest rate policies and other sorts of macro issues which were out of balance in so many places. Today, those still matter, but it's a different set of issues, either at the micro level or in questions about the relationship between development and political systems, which is very much back on the fore today, which you alluded to. So the questions are what are working and what doesn't work. And that, I very much like the analogy of venture capitalists. I've used it a lot. I've quoted Ed on part of it. Is Ed here with us yet? Not quite.
He's still
in terms of recognizing that venture capitalists can be successful even when a large share of their investments fail. because a small share of them work really, really well. And I think that analogy works very, very well for us. So the question that we're trying to reorient ourselves, led by the work of Ruth Levine, who another CGD alum who's not with us tonight, who's led the way on a new evaluation policy for USAID, is to begin to change that thinking. We, from the U.S., can't change or lead what happens in development. We can support. We can help be a catalyst. We can help accelerate, perhaps, under certain circumstances. And we have to look for those opportunities where we can, help that change take place, but be humble enough to recognize that we are not the ones that can lead it or bring it about, but can help instead help support it or accelerate it. And so the challenge for us is to think about those kinds of interventions and where and how we can be most supportive of them. It's a difficult change to bring about. It takes understanding and taking the risks that Oliver was talking about, being ready to embrace failure in some ways and not be scared of it. That's hard, particularly in this budget environment. But the challenge for us is to move towards that. And thinking really about how aid can help change incentives or reinforce incentives that are moving in the right direction. The budget support debate, I think, has also been captured by extremes of one versus the other, rather than thinking on the margin about, well, how can financing be used to change the institutional incentives on the margin for better policies, for better institutional strengthening, for doing the things that some policymakers want to do, but need those incentives changed. So we're in the process of doing that. It's very hard, and I'm looking forward to your book to help us all learn more about how we can do that.
Just thinking back on Pakistan, one of the messages that was very clear from policymakers there was trade, not aid, capturing a little bit of Esther's first point. And I'm also glad to say from its inception, CGD has worried about an entire range of policies that affect people in the developing world, not just aid. Let's go to those of you out there for questions and comments. Is that Molly? Okay, Molly. Introduce yourself, please.
Sure, I'm Molly Kinder from the Center for Global Development. Esther, that was a wonderful lecture. I loved every minute of it. My question for you is this notion of turning these ideas into action, and especially those of us at CGD are part of a community that's trying to take good ideas and evidence and turn that into changes in policy and programs. And I wonder if you could shed some light on some of the lessons you learned along the way when you have this evidence and you have these new ideas, to what extent those have been turned into changed policies and changed programs, and what that might mean for some lessons you might share with us as we try to do similar efforts.
Thank you. That's a great question. We start to have a little bit on that, not that much, because JPAL is about 5 years old, and the first 5 years we were focused on trying to generate some evidence, because it's not that you can do one study and then run and say, well, this is what we should do the world over. So it involves a little bit of time. But we started to accumulate some things. So now we have more of we are moving to this second step. And this is amazingly interesting work. It's very, very different from setting up an experiment, or you would think. It's kind of engaging with the policy process, with these men and women that I was talking about, like real people, and try to figure out like how to get across to them on what layers of things are we working on, how. And one of the things that I've learned that I didn't really expect, but I was very happy to have learned, is that when you come to a policymaker say in India, or in India is where I have most experience with actual policy makers, usually in state government, with an idea, saying, well, we've done that somewhere else in India and it worked. They say, great, let's do an experiment. So people are, in fact, quite willing to accept the idea that if you tested something in an experiment, they also need to do their own experiment. So that means that things are a little bit slower into scaling themselves up, which I think in a sense is great because I'm not in any particular rush. But I like the idea that people are not going to just take, I don't, people shouldn't take anything I say as a truth because, it comes from elsewhere. It might not scale up well within a policy process because what you do in an NGO, once you add up all the layers of bureaucracy in a government, may not work, etc. So that's kind of the process we are engaged in. This makes for a very difficult project to kind of move a whole government bureaucracy on much larger project, but we are starting to make progress, and it's really fun. So, and once we have that second layer of things, then I'm kind of very curious to see whether then things will scale up or whether, again, people will continue to want to experiment forever. I should add one thing. One of the very recent developments that is very interesting and very comforting is that we are contacted more and more by governments who want to build up their monitoring and evaluation units, and who think we are the people to do that. And the way they want to do it is by running a project with us and then building up their teams around that project, and then us going away and leaving their team behind. And if that works, I think that could make like a pretty lasting difference in how things are done.
Yeah, Uwe Dadush with the Carnegie Endowment. Enjoyed it enormously, very interesting. Two questions. One is, I wonder whether you could say a word about the intellectual history of JPAL, how it came about. Sorry, I did my training a long time ago, so I'm a little out of touch. The second is what do you see as the limitations, the weaknesses of your approach?
It's fun to get that question from Uri. We'll ask you later about your more macro history and point of view, but not now. We'll leave it to Esther. We won't put you on the spot now. Uri's made huge contributions to thinking at the macro level.
The intellectual history in a few sentences. So randomized evaluation, randomized control trial have been around for a very long time. They've been a part of, not a very important part, but a part of US social policy evaluation since the 60s, and had not been very frequently used in development for a long time. And then started being used. Michael Kramer from Harvard was one of the persons. And then, of course, there was a Progressa program, which had a large-scale experiment. It started showing that Michael's efforts and then the Progressa program were kind of showing that this can be done, actually. And a number of us started doing experiments on this and that and the other, a little bit in an opportunistic way at the beginning, whatever, we can find a partner who is willing to work with us. And after a few years, it started to accumulate into a corpus, both of results, but mainly of how do you do these things. And we thought that it would be good to embed that into an organization, to not just do our own projects one after the other, because we needed an infrastructure to communicate the results to policymakers. That had been the idea from the beginning, and also to kind of make progress on the method and kind of provide public goods for working with that particular way of doing things. And that's kind of how JPAL was started. I think when we started it with Abhijit Banerjee and Sandil Mullainathan and Rachel Glenister, I don't think we had any view of like that it was going to grow the way it has. We were just kind of starting it and then hang our shingle one day, start a website and saying, well, now we're JPAL. Well, at the time we were just PAL. Then J came. So that's for the very short intellectual history of it. I think it kind of overtook us, which I'm very pleased for. The limitations, are plenty. I mean, in a sense, it's a very useful tool, randomized evaluation. But it's just a tool. So, you know, you give a hammer to a child and they'll break a window. Like, in that sense, that's no better. It's as good as the use of it. It has good collateral benefits, like it forces you to collect data, and therefore usually it forces you to spend a lot of time in the field and figure out what the data is, which I think is a good benefit. But then there are questions that it's not very well set up to answer. The macro question, of course, very long-run historical question, and equilibrium question, so to speak. When you have a policy that might have a different effect when it's applied to an entire country than when it's done at the local level. So sometimes if those equilibrium phenomena are local, can be captured locally, you can set up these very large experiments that are at the market level, but they become hard, but they are feasible. Some of them are happening. We did one like in half of France for active labor market policies. But if it's policies that would have externality at the level of a country, then of course you couldn't even go there. So you would have to combine the parameters that you could get from experiment or other things with some modeling in order to understand what might happen at the macro levels. These three things, I say, would be the big limitation.
Esther has in fact been so successful that there's a little bit of alarm in the economics community that about 95% of all PhD dissertations now, I'm exaggerating, and certainly in development, involve a student doing a randomized controlled trial. That's okay, you know. I have Arvind Subramanian, you wanted to?
The Peterson Institute and the Center for Global Development. Esther, thanks for the lecture a lot. I wanted to ask you just one question, which may be a little bit, outside the talk that you gave and some of the work you've done. What do you think explains what seemed to be some really big changes happening in the developing world in terms of over the last 15 years? There seems to be, convergence taking place, not just in terms of, income and standards of living, but across the board, health, et cetera, et cetera. And what is your reading of this? Is it because there's some politics, macro, big changes taking place, or is it because, the ideas that you're propagating are kind of catching hold? What is your, do you think something big is happening? And what is your sense of the, causes for this, hopefully, big and positive changes happening?
I'm afraid this is above my pay grade.
Shed your modesty.
It's too bad Charles Kenny, who's a senior fellow at the center, I think he's upstairs. Are you here, Charles? Ah, there you are. Charles just had his book published, Getting Better. Have I got the title right? Do you want to say something on why? Or his book concentrates on this fact that things really have gotten better. It is wrong to be down on how terrible everything is in the developing world.
At this point, the only thing to say is it's getting better because of Esther's work.
I think I would leave it at that.
Yeah, okay.
I think there are two. I think there are
We're selling a lot of books here, I hope.
You.
Steve has a great book, too, that we published. Which is also about things getting better.
Motion event,
Getting better in Africa, so.
Maybe I'll say one thing. I think there are two aspects to your question that we can separate. One is, some countries are starting to grow and they were not growing before, or Vietnam or India or whatever. And I think at least I don't understand any of that. That's definitely above my pay grade. I would tend to think that not very many people understand what's going on. In fact, you have a beautiful paper that, a lot of people think maybe in India it's because of trade liberalization, but really they started growing in the 1980s, so maybe not in the end. So I think we understand very little why countries suddenly catch up and go as a profession. And some people should definitely work on that, but I think it's a very, 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 very hard problem. The second element is this, this getting better kind of phenomenon, which is kind of distinct because it started a long time ago. It's been progressive. The improvement in life mortality. A lot of them happen because of aid, actually, of like a lot of drugs and things like that becoming available in the developing world, and that's kind of more like long-run phenomenon. That I think we can make much more progress into answering, because at least in an accounting sense, because we know how much life can immunizations from measles save, and we know how many people got immunized and why. So I think this part of it we can account for it much better. And we can also, that said, there is some half full, half empty kind of a glass there. It's true that it's correct to emphasize on, everybody's saying the glass is half empty and it's really half full, but it's still only half full, which is, I'm not very sure what's the benchmark and what should we aspire to. For health, for example, to the extent that the medicines are in principle available, should we be content with the life expectancy having improved by, 12 years, or should we want a full convergence? I don't know.
I think a lot of people, it's a vague answer, but technology, global integration, and maybe most important, changes in global norms. I think democracy, the case of the Middle East, and certainly the changed view because of global norms of the role and contribution and status of women strikes me as. So, but these are big and vague issues. Bob, you had a question, and then Nancy Lee.
Bob Kaplan at the Inter-American Foundation, which is it's a very small U.S. government agency that responds directly to communities throughout Latin America who present their proposal, and then we fund them. So I'm really is very much taken with your talk, and also your focus at the micro. We really focus at the micro, and we don't focus so much on intervention. We focus on responding, and it's really about the communities themselves who are trying to figure out what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. One of the things that strikes me as I go visit communities is they've got much more access to information about a whole range of things, and they're trying to make sense of what could help them and what could hurt them. So I guess my question is, what advice do you have for how we can work with communities in helping them to understand what can help them and what can hurt them without trying to think that we can figure that all out for them? Because in the end, it's very context specific, and they're probably best to figure out that by themselves with some help.
What Bob wants is that JPAL ask communities what experiment.
Exactly.
We want this experiment or that experiment. Give us a menu of experiments.
Let me just say one more thing about that, because we talk about learning a lot in the Inter-American Foundation, and the question is always, who are we learning for? Is it for us to learn? Is it to help USAID or the World Bank? Or is it for the communities themselves and the questions that they have to help their lives? Because there are, like you, I'm very hopeful. When I visit the communities, it's fantastic. People are doing amazing things, and they've got so much hope, and they're working so hard. So it'd be nice to be able to answer them in that way.
So on this last point, I think we have to, information is a global public good, which is why I think international agencies are well placed to fund the provision of that information, and why I think it's actually pertinent that information goes above and beyond this particular program or this particular community, but has something to bring to the rest of the world in general. And I think it's almost always the case. On the specific questions about the communities, I'd say I guess one thing which is not quite a response to your question, but might be pertinent anyway, which is that another set of results that is quite interesting and a little bit frightening is how much in this community-based decision-making, how much the rules of who decides matter. Another Ben Olken experiment in the same context as the road, he people were invited to meetings in order to oversee this project. In Indonesia, people are invited to meetings, community meetings. But so the way, the structure was like, well, people need to come to community meeting and everybody is invited. But what he realized quickly into the project is that very few people were coming because in Indonesia, you don't show up to something unless you have received a written invitation. So first, sending a written invitation made a huge difference in terms of people coming to the meeting. Secondly, they had comment forms attached to some of the invitation. But they tried to elicit like complaints against corruption, etc. And there again, in one set of villages, the comment forms were given to the village chief to distribute, which is kind of the natural thing to do. But then in other forms, they were distributed through school children. And in the places where the comment forms were distributed to the chief, of course, they went to the friends of the chief, and that made no difference. Whereas in the one sub-treatment where comment forms were distributed to the school children, then you had an effect of this intervention on corruption. So this is showing how much there is to figure out between, oh, wouldn't that be nice to ask the community what they want, and how we are going to do it. And so in some sense, if that's your line of trade, then one thing I would do is to try and work on rules, on the impact of rules. And I've done also some of my own work on, rules of decentralized government, who can run, whether you should have quotas for women and things like that. All of these things make a huge difference. So the elicitation process of the community preferences is very important. That doesn't answer what community should want, but that answers, how do you go from what people actually want to how the preferences actually aggregate into a proposal that you receive. And paying attention to that would be very nice.
Okay, so there are 3 people who have indicated they want to say something, and then I'm afraid I'll have to close the list so that we stay reasonably close to on time. I know many of you have hundreds of ideas and questions, but we'll have a reception and you can pose them to Esther directly. So first, Ngozi has a 2-hander, which is a very inside way of saying she gets about 20 seconds. And then we have Nancy Lee, and then we have a third person.
The 20 seconds is on this. I think all we're saying is this speaks to the design of projects and programs at the community level. I think the mistake from the aid side is thinking you can stay outside and design something without understanding what happens in that village, which may be the power structure or the way things are done can be quite different from the next village. So the lesson learned is it's not what if you want to make a change, you've got to be there to see what's actually transpiring in that particular community in order to design something sensible.
Okay, thank you, Ngozi. Nancy.
Actually, this works.
Introduce yourself, Nancy.
Oh, Nancy Lee from the Treasury Department. It's a larger government agency, but we have funding problems. This question actually follows very closely on what Ngozi said. What I was going to ask is about the universality of the application of your evidence. Because if you do a randomized trial for a drug, you can be pretty sure if you have a population with certain characteristics in one part of the world, the drug will work if it has those characteristics in another part of the world. So my question is, and we know the example of Progressa, for example, which has worked in a huge variety of different settings. So, and the virtue of randomized trials is you should be able to get to some universality of application. So, is it the case, are you finding that a sort of a micro intervention in India works in the same way as that same intervention in Bolivia if you have roughly the same kind of poor population?
I think the answer is, again, we can draw on the medical trials, which is when you run a medical trial in a population, and you're not allowed to expand beyond the population, beyond that population, or maybe you are, or maybe you need to run another trial for that population. And I think the way you make progress in science, and that's true for medical trial, and that's true for our kind of trial as well, is really in 2 dimensions. So number one, you accumulate more evidence, so you kind of replicate in different contexts, or with slightly different programs. Number two is you're trying to go to what is the underlying principle behind this intervention having an impact. So, for example, you run a remedial education program in India with people hired from the community. You find a positive effect. Then you start thinking, why is it that remedial education is so important, it has such large effect? It must tell me something about the educational system in India. And in fact, it does. It seems, I think, related to the fact that the system in India is very, very elite based. And then you start looking at other countries and say, well, do they have that problem too? And you realize, well, that's a problem that's reasonably frequent because that's in part a product of historical legacy, where the education system were for an elite. And so then you can form an hypothesis that a system that interventions, so you don't only have your remedial education program run by Pratham, you have that idea that in systems which are very, very elite curriculum and which have scaled up in a huge way, most of the kids in schools are not being taught at a level at which they can understand anything. And so from that insight that you got from getting your first answer to the trial, you can develop other programs that would address the same problem. For example, computer-assisted learning that would target at different levels. For example, tracking by level of ability, retraining the teachers. All of that would progressively help you refine and say, yes, that's really the issue that needs to be addressed. And that's the concept that has some measure of a universality, as opposed to this is the intervention. So what happens when I gave an example, or what I was saying in response to Molly's question is usually when you move from one place to another, people want to run another experiment, which I think is great for this reason. But it keeps it, and usually the program changes in the meantime. So you develop kind of another program that is supposed to address a similar problem that is also experienced in that place. So for example, this remedial education program, this organization Pratham I was mentioning in the talk ran a very, very successful one. Then you can say, well, move to Ghana, say, and they have lots of young people that have to do 1 year of community services. So they were interested in trying to do a program where they would use these young people to teach the kids in school. But the way they do it, again, they do an experiment in their own country. We now have a prior that is likely to work because Ghana has the same elite bias problem. But of course, we are not sure until we see the results. So that's kind of the way so in a sense, one answer is collecting more data and filling the dot. The other answer is doing the exercise that we are doing in the book, which is some concept along all of these things. The book is not it's not like a summary of the evidence. It has a lot of opinions in it, which is some form of a theory around each of these schemes. Because without that theory, then you can't really
the reason this is a revolution that Esther has led, a way to put it is, at least in economics, that the tradition has been much more deductive. You develop a theory and a hypothesis and you test it. And this is about learning from on the ground and trying to develop a theory by inducing after much time. Okay, we have one last question, please.
Frank Wiebe from MCC. Esther, it's exciting to hear about the work that you're doing and your colleagues who are involved in RCTs. But the reality on the ground, whether it's in development agencies or in governments, our own or in developing countries, is that most of the work that we're doing is not being evaluated by RCTs. It's being evaluated, if at all, by much less rigorous means. And so what's your advice when you are building a monitoring and evaluation system in a country, helping strengthen it? What's your advice in terms of system strengthening? Is it that we need to be just trying to do more and more RCTs? Or are there lessons that we can draw from your methods that will enhance the rigor even when we can't do it right?
So there is certainly a moment where you want to, I think in some sense we might want to do fewer impact evaluation and do those well. And then maybe spend some of the money into more process evaluation. So the way I would, it's not conditional actually. The way, what I'm trying to, where we are trying to discuss with the government with whom we are working is to say, you guys have to focus on what it is you really want to know. And that's the impact evaluation you're going to run, not on the massive project that is for the whole state, but on an experimental basis. And for the rest, for the programs that are going on anywhere, then you just try to collect regular data and try to put them into an MIS that can actually be accessed by a human being and these kind of things. I think one of the mistakes that one of the sort of wrong turn that has happened, but I think people are kind of turning back again, is to say, oh, everything needs to have an impact evaluation, which is a recipe for saying that no impact evaluation is any good. I think it's much better to say, again, the knowledge is global public good if it's something that is of interest for the population at large. And I think it's much better to spend the effort and the money on these projects that are difficult and all that on a smaller number of them. And then for the rest, kind of just measure what is being done on a process basis. It's kind of old-fashioned, but like counting the textbook and that kind of stuff.
The other systemic thing that Frank, I know, probably knows about it, I believe MCC has joined the IIIE. We're very proud of that at CGD. It was our colleague Ruth Levine with her working group that started, including Esther, that led to the creation of this organization whose mainstream activity is to develop what are the enduring questions. Maybe it's too macro so far for Esther, and then to find third-party evaluators, including JPAL, to address and to develop some external validity, as the term is, for some of the findings. Esther, thank you very much. That was absolutely superb.